I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and told me there was no space for me in the home my late husband built with his bare hands. She stood there, polished and smiling, one hand on her mother's shoulder, and said it as if she were offering me kindness. "Mom, starting this fall, you'll live with your sister. There's just no space here anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded the way quiet women of my generation do when the younger ones think they know better. But inside me, something shifted. That night, I walked through every room of that house. The marks on the wall from Daniel's childhood, the smell of Robert's aftershave still faint in our old bedroom. All of it whispered the same thing. You built this. You don't owe anyone an apology for existing here. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I called an old student of mine now, a real estate agent, and said, "Linda, I need to sell my house." But quietly. No one saw it coming. Not my son, too busy avoiding confrontation. Not Jenna, too certain she'd finally taken control. When she came home from work a few weeks later and found strangers moving boxes through the front door, her face turned pale. They told her the house had been sold. And that's when my story truly began. My name is Margaret Turner. I'm 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher and a widow of 6 years. I live in the same house my husband Robert built back when we were both too young to know what forever really meant. These days, it's not just my home anymore. My son Daniel and his wife Jenna moved in a few years ago after they had their little girl, Ella. I told myself it would be good to have laughter in the house again. And it was at least for a while. Most mornings began quietly. The light would fall through the kitchen window just the way it always had, soft and golden. I'd put on the kettle, wait for the water to hum, and listen to the birds outside the garden. Old habits die hard. I still make enough oatmeal for 3, even though Daniel usually rushes out with just a coffee, and Jenna prefers her protein shake. Ella is the only one who still likes my cooking. "Grandma's pancakes are fluffier," she says, and every time she says it, I feel a small victory in my chest. The garden is my peace. Robert used to call it my quiet classroom. I taught myself how to grow almost anything in that soil, roses, tomatoes, even herbs for the Sunday roast. I still talk to him sometimes when I'm out there pulling weeds. "You'd laugh, Rob," I whispered one morning. "The house feels full, but somehow smaller." It was true. The rooms were the same size, but something had changed. Jenna had a way of arranging things: new curtains, modern furniture, candles that smelled of vanilla and ambition. She'd started saying things like, "Our kitchen needs more light," or "We should redo our living room soon." At first, I liked that she cared, but slowly that word "our" began to sound different. Not like family, but like ownership. Still, I didn't want to stir up trouble. I've lived long enough to know that young women have their own ways of doing things. So I smiled, nodded, and let her decorate the walls where Robert's paintings once hung. "Fresh look," she said brightly. "A new chapter." I told her it was lovely, even though I missed the old one. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, a letter came in the mail that caught my eye. It was from the bank, addressed to Daniel and Margaret Turner. I thought it was odd. We'd never shared bank accounts, not even after he moved in. I opened it out of habit, thinking it might be something about property taxes. Inside was a statement, numbers, and balances I didn't recognize. It looked like a mortgage document. That couldn't be right. The house was paid off 20 years ago. When Daniel got home, I asked about it casually. "Oh," that he said a little too quickly. "Just some paperwork I handled with the bank." "Don't worry about it, Mom." Then he smiled the way sons do when they think they can charm you out of asking more questions. I wanted to press, but something in his eyes, nervous, distracted, made me stop. Maybe he needed space too. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the pipes breathing the wind, tapping the windows, the quiet footsteps of my granddaughter padding down the hallway. It used to comfort me, those small noises of life continuing. But now they felt uncertain, as if the house itself knew something I didn't. The next morning, Jenna stood at the counter sipping coffee, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I came in. "Morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Morning," she murmured, not looking up. Ella came running in a moment later, her backpack bouncing, hair a mess of curls. "Grandma." "I can't find my lunchbox," she said, and I smiled, relieved to be useful. I found it on the counter where Jenna had left it after unpacking groceries. "Here it is, sweetheart," I said, handing it over. Jenna finally looked up, her tone softening. "Thanks, Mom." She still calls me that sometimes. It sounds nice, but there's always a flicker behind it, like she's trying to remember if she really means it. After they left, the house felt emptier than usual. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of my teacup with my finger. The morning sun hit the corner of the old dining table where Robert and I carved our initials years ago, R+M still faintly visible under the varnish. That little carving had survived new coats of paint, new furniture, even Jenna's redecorating sprees. I liked to think it was the heart of the house, the reminder that we'd built this place from nothing. But lately, I felt like a guest in my own life. There were unspoken things moving between Daniel and Jenna, something secretive and impatient. I told myself not to imagine the worst. Families have quiet seasons. I'd seen that often enough. But in my gut, I felt a familiar unease, the same feeling I had the year Robert got sick, when everything looked normal on the outside. But I knew something was about to change. That afternoon, I walked out to the porch with my tea. The air smelled like cut grass and late summer. For a moment, I could almost pretend life was the same as before, when the house was filled with laughter and not tension. But even the air felt heavier now, as if it knew the calm wouldn't last. I didn't know it yet, but that day would be the last peaceful one for a long time. That evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, Jenna came in from work looking unusually composed. She smiled too sweetly and said, "Mom, after dinner, can we talk? There's something important I'd like to discuss about fall." The way she said it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something told me that whatever she wanted to say, it wasn't going to feel like family. I didn't know then that one short conversation would split my world in two, the life before that evening and everything that came after. After dinner, the house was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher. Ella had gone upstairs for her bath, and Daniel was sitting in the living room scrolling through his phone. Jenna cleared her throat, that little sound she makes when she's rehearsed something in her head and wants everyone's attention. "Mom," she began, her tone even practiced. "Can we talk for a minute?" She gestured toward the table as if this were a meeting instead of a conversation. I sat down slowly. I'd been part of this family long enough to recognize when something unpleasant was coming. Jenna smiled, polite and professional, as if she were delivering news to a client, not to her husband's mother, so she started folding her hands neatly. "You know, my mom's been having a hard time since her hip surgery." I nodded. "Of course." "How's she doing now?" "She's fine," Jenna said quickly. "But living alone isn't really safe for her anymore. The stairs, the distance from the hospital, it's been hard." Her voice softened, and for a moment I thought maybe she just wanted advice, maybe even compassion. But then she took a small breath and continued. "So Daniel and I have been talking, and we think the best thing is for her to move in here. Maybe sometime around September." For a second I thought I'd misheard. "Move in," I repeated, careful not to let the surprise show too much. She nodded, still smiling. "Yes, it just makes sense. We've got the extra bedroom upstairs, and it'll be easier for us to help her day to day. I tried to picture the house, the rooms, the spaces we'd shared for years. The extra bedroom she was talking about was mine. I could feel my pulse in my throat. And where would I be during all that? I asked, my voice gentle but trembling slightly. Jenna didn't hesitate. Well, that's what we wanted to talk about, she said, glancing at Daniel, who kept his eyes on the table. We thought you might be more comfortable staying with your sister for a while. You've mentioned how quiet her place is, and it's only a few hours away. It could be a nice change. There it was, the sentence that broke the air clean in half. There's just not enough space for everyone. She said it with a little shrug, as if she were talking about a storage problem, not a person. It's just for now, she added, her tone sweet, rehearsed, almost merciful. You know, until we can figure out something more permanent. Daniel still hadn't looked up. I watched the side of his face, the muscle in his jaw twitching. I wanted him to say something, anything. But silence from him had become its own kind of answer. I see, I said quietly, more to myself than to them. Jenna leaned forward, her eyes bright with relief that I wasn't making a scene. I know it's a lot to process, but really, Mom, this will be better for everyone. You'll have your own space, and my mom will have help when she needs it. It's practical. That word stung more than I expected. Practical. As if love, loyalty, and memory had been reduced to logistics. I wanted to remind her that this was the home Robert and I built from nothing, that I'd raised Daniel here, that every corner of this place still held echoes of our lives. But the moment felt already decided. Instead, I focused on the smallest details, the flickering light above the table, the faint clinking of plates from the kitchen, the smell of detergent still hanging in the air. I realized that if I spoke now, I'd either cry or say something I couldn't take back. So I just folded my hands the way she had and took a slow breath. Your mother's lucky to have you, I said finally, forcing my voice to sound calm. Jenna smiled a little too brightly. Thank you. We just want to do what's right for everyone. I looked at Daniel then. He glanced up for the briefest moment, his eyes full of guilt and something worse, fear. Fear that I'd make this hard, fear that I'd remind him whose name was carved into the wood of the porch out front. I didn't. I couldn't. I stood pretending to tidy the table. Well, I said softly, it sounds like you've made up your minds. Mom, Daniel started, but the words died before they reached me. Jenna touched his arm gently, and he fell silent again. I carried the empty plates to the sink, my hands steady, though my heart wasn't. Behind me, Jenna said something about planning logistics and moving dates, her voice fading into the background hum of the house. I focused on the water running over my hands, the sound of it steady cleansing. When I turned back, they were both watching me carefully, as if waiting for a reaction. I gave them none. I'll think about it, I said simply. Jenna nodded, satisfied. Of course, take your time. I smiled politely, the kind of smile you wear to keep your dignity when everything inside you is cracking. You've both thought this through, I said. I'm sure it'll work out just fine. Then I excused myself, walked upstairs to my room, the extra bedroom, and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to their voices downstairs, blending with the clatter of dishes. For a long time, I stared at the photograph of Robert and me on the nightstand. His eyes seemed to ask me a question I didn't know how to answer. I smiled politely, but inside something quietly broke. I went to bed that night without saying another word. I could hear them downstairs long after I turned off the light, Jenna talking in that efficient, composed tone of hers, Daniel answering with short, tired hums. Their voices blended with the creak of the old floors, the same floors Robert used to walk across in his work boots, leaving little scuffs that I never had the heart to buff out. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when my home had started to sound like someone else's house. The next morning, I moved through the rooms slowly, as if I were visiting a museum of my own life. The sun was spilling through the hallway windows, catching the dust in a soft golden haze. On the wall near the stairs were the faint pencil marks I'd made years ago. Daniel's height chart each year, another line higher. I ran my hand over it, remembering the day he reached my shoulder, and laughed that he'd soon be taller than me. Not too soon, I'd said then, smiling, but he'd outgrown me within a year. Now he walked through this house like a stranger, passing through a familiar hotel lobby. In the living room, I could almost hear Robert's laughter, deep, warm, the kind that filled a room and wrapped itself around you. He used to sit by the window with his morning coffee and say, "We built something good here, Maggie. A place where everyone belongs." I could still see him there in my mind, the way he'd tip his chair back and grin when I scolded him for it. The echo of that joy lingered in the air like an old melody. But now those memories made the silence heavier. I tried to shake it off, but the ache settled deep in my chest. How could I be unwanted in my own home? The thought felt unreal, almost embarrassing, like a bad dream I'd wake from. I'd given everything to this family, my years, my savings, my love. I'd made room for them not just in this house, but in my heart. And now somehow I'd become the extra piece of furniture that didn't fit the new decor. To distract myself, I decided to tidy up the study, the little room Robert had used as his workshop. It hadn't changed much since he passed. The smell of sawdust still clung to the drawers, faint but comforting. There was a stack of old folders in the cabinet papers I hadn't looked at in years. I figured I might as well start sorting things before Jenna began making suggestions about what should stay or go. Most of the folders held predictable things: tax returns, warranty slips for appliances that probably didn't even exist anymore, school photos of Daniel yellowed and curling at the edges. I smiled at one where he was missing a front tooth, proudly clutching a paper ribbon that said, "Best Helper." Then I came across a manila envelope labeled "Property Documents." Inside were the original deed papers for the house, the same ones Robert and I had signed nearly 40 years ago. My name was still there, neat and strong in blue ink. Next to it, Robert's signature, steady and confident. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the faint grooves left by his pen. But behind those papers were newer ones. I frowned. The paper was bright, white, crisp, not the kind that had sat untouched for decades. The header read, "Refinance Agreement." My eyes moved down the page. Borrowers. Daniel Turner and Margaret Turner. My stomach turned cold. I flipped through, scanning line after line loan amounts, payment terms, the bank's logo printed at the top. And there it was again, my name written neatly in the signature space. Only it wasn't my handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it, blinking hard as if the words might rearrange themselves into something harmless. But they didn't. I pulled out my reading glasses, slipped them on, and looked again. The loops in the letters, the slant of the M, even the flourish at the end. It all looked close enough to mine that anyone else might believe it. Almost perfect. Almost. I set the papers down on the desk, my hands trembling slightly. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Everything looked ordinary, but the air felt wrong heavy. I thought back to the bank letter that had arrived last week, the one addressed to both Daniel and me. I remembered the way he'd brushed it off, saying not to worry. My heart began to pound. It wasn't possible, was it? Daniel would never forge my name. Not my own son. I tried to tell myself there must be an explanation, that maybe there had been some misunderstanding, or a clerical error. But the more I looked, the clearer it became that this was deliberate. The strokes were too practiced, the placement too exact. Someone had tried very hard to make it look like I'd agreed to something I never even knew existed. I sat back in Robert's old chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. My hands found the armrests the way his used to, grounding myself in the solidness of the seat, the familiarity of the room. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, forcing my heartbeat to steady. If this was true, if Daniel had done this, then everything I believed about this family, about loyalty and trust, was standing on rotten boards. I could feel the ground shifting under me, quiet, but certain. I needed to think, to move carefully. I folded the papers neatly back into the envelope and placed it in the drawer under a pile of magazines. I would not confront anyone yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was looking at. But as I turned to leave the room, my eyes caught the faint blue signature again. It was smooth, confident, and eerily familiar. My own name written by someone else's hand. The signature looked like hers, but I had never held that pen. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the papers spread across the desk like the ruins of something I once trusted. The late afternoon light had shifted across the floor, stretching long and gold the way it used to when Robert would come home from work and ask what was for dinner. I could almost hear his voice in that stillness, and for the first time in years it didn't comfort me. It felt like a warning. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that forged line, my name written by someone else's hand. My son's hand, maybe. The thought made my chest ache so deeply that I pressed my palm against it just to feel something solid. I tried to tell myself there must be an explanation, that Daniel wouldn't do something dishonest, not to me. But the longer I thought about it, the less sense it made. He had been distant lately, working long hours, avoiding eye contact when I asked about bills or the house. And that letter from the bank, it hadn't been an accident. By morning, I knew I couldn't just sit in the dark and wonder. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. So I dressed, fixed my hair, and took the early bus into town. The teller at our local branch was a young woman named Sarah, someone I'd known since she was in grade school. She smiled when she saw me, but her smile faltered when I quietly slid the documents across the counter and asked her to help me understand them. "I just want to make sure everything's correct," I said, keeping my voice calm. She went into the back for a while. When she returned, she looked uneasy, as if she wished someone else had to tell me. "Mrs. Turner," she began softly, "it looks like your son refinanced the mortgage about 6 months ago. Both names are on the paperwork, so technically the bank assumed you were aware." 6 months. That was around the time Daniel and Jenna had started talking about remodeling the kitchen. My stomach twisted. I thanked her quietly, folded the papers back into my bag, and walked outside. The autumn air was cool, sharp, with the smell of fallen leaves. I sat on a bench near the bus stop and tried to steady my breathing. He had done it behind my back. My own son. I thought of all the years I'd spent protecting him, of the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, of the day I signed the house over to include his name, so that if anything happened to me, he'd have a home. I had done it out of love, and somehow that love had been turned into leverage. Still, anger didn't come right away. It was disbelief, first a quiet, heavy kind of shock that made the world blur at the edges. Maybe Jenna had pushed him into it. Maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe he'd planned to tell me, but lost his nerve. I wanted to believe one of those maybes. But underneath them all was a truth I couldn't ignore. The house wasn't safe under his control anymore. When I got home, I made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The sunlight fell through the lace curtains, scattering soft patterns on the floor. I watched them dance and thought about Robert. He'd always been so steady, so certain. Maggie, he used to say, if you ever find yourself standing in a room where you're not respected, don't beg to stay. Protect your place or walk away with dignity. At the time, I thought he meant workplace politics or friendships gone sour. Now, sitting in the house we built together, I realized he'd meant something much larger. I didn't confront Daniel that evening. I made dinner as usual, smiled when Ella told me about her day, and listened as Jenna talked about her mother's doctor appointments. I watched Daniel quietly noticing how he avoided looking at me. The guilt was there plain as day, but I said nothing. I wasn't ready for a fight. I needed to think. After they went to bed, I stayed up late in the living room with the old file box open beside me. The lamp cast a soft pool of light over the papers, and the rest of the room fell into shadow. I sorted through every document I could find, the original deed, Robert's will, old tax forms, anything that could tell me exactly where I stood. The truth was simple but powerful. Half this house was still mine. No matter what Daniel had done, no matter what Jenna planned, they couldn't take that from me. Not legally, not yet. A strange calm came over me then. For weeks I had felt helpless, like someone standing on thin ice, waiting for it to crack. But now I saw something I hadn't seen before, a way to step off the ice before it gave way. I didn't know exactly what I would do, only that I would act quietly, carefully, and in my own time. As I gathered the papers and tucked them back into their envelopes, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked older than I remembered, but there was something steady in my eyes, a light I hadn't seen in years. I thought of Robert's words again, and this time they didn't sound like advice. They sounded like permission. That night I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because things were fixed, but because I finally knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called a real estate agent, my former student Linda. I hadn't seen her in years, but her voice was exactly the same, warm, direct, confident. Mrs. Turner. "Oh, my goodness, it's been forever," she said, laughing softly. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Linda, I need to sell my house," I said quietly. "But it has to be done privately, no signs, no online listings. Can you help me with that?" There was a short silence, the kind that tells you someone is processing something important. Then she said, "Of course. Let's meet this afternoon." When she pulled into my driveway later that day, I felt the first flicker of control I'd had in weeks. She stepped out of her car in a sharp navy jacket, her hair tied neatly back. "You haven't changed a bit," she said as we hugged. I smiled at that kind words, even if they weren't true. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once graded her spelling tests. So she said gently, "Tell me what's going on." I didn't tell her everything. I didn't mention the forged signature or the conversation about no space. I only said that I was ready to simplify my life, to start fresh, somewhere smaller. She looked at me for a long moment, studying my face as if she could see the unspoken parts. "We can list it off market," she said finally. "No signs, no website, just word of mouth within my network. It's slower but quiet. Private. You'll get serious buyers only." I nodded. That's exactly what I want. We walked through the house together. Linda took notes but didn't take photos at my request. "It's a beautiful home," she said softly as we paused in the living room. "You can feel the years in it, but in a good way." I smiled faintly. "Yes, you can." That night after she left, I sat by the window with the folder of refinance papers in my lap. I'd gone back to the bank earlier in the week and confirmed everything Daniel had taken out a large loan against the house, most of it already spent. If I sold the property, the first thing that would have to happen was to pay off that debt. The thought made my stomach twist. I could have confronted him. I could have shouted, cried, demanded explanations. But what good would that do? It wouldn't change what he'd done. And it wouldn't give me back my dignity. The next morning, I visited the bank again. Sarah, the young teller, helped me arrange to pay off the outstanding loan. I used the savings Robert and I had built over the years, the account I had sworn never to touch unless I truly needed it. This qualifies as need, I whispered to myself as I signed the transfer slip. When it was done, I felt something lift inside me, something small but significant. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood. The house was mine again, free and clear. Linda called 2 days later. "I have a buyer interested," she said. "They're a quiet couple looking for something with history. They don't want to change much, just care for it." I felt my throat tighten, but I managed to say, "That sounds right." We agreed on a timeline, 6 weeks to closing. It would give me time to go through everything slowly, to pack what mattered, to let go of what didn't. Each day after that followed a quiet rhythm. In the mornings, I packed small boxes in my room, old letters, photos, keepsakes, and labeled them neatly. In the afternoons, I tended the garden so everything looked normal. If Jenna or Daniel noticed anything missing, they didn't say. I smiled, cooked dinner, asked about their days. I became invisible in plain sight. One afternoon, as I wrapped a framed picture of Robert and me from our wedding day, I caught my reflection in the glass. My face was calm, but my eyes looked sharper, clearer. There was no malice in what I was doing. It wasn't revenge out of cruelty. It was justice done quietly. I wasn't stealing anything. I was simply reclaiming what had always been mine. In the evenings after they went to bed, I'd sit in the study and make lists. Things to take. People to notify. I even found a small apartment by the coast, the kind of place Robert and I used to dream about when we were younger. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom and a little balcony overlooking the water. But it was enough. Enough for peace. Jenna and Daniel were busy making plans for her mother's arrival, discussing furniture arrangements, storage, new paint colors. They spoke freely around me as though I were already gone. Each time I heard them, the decision I'd made felt more right. There was no room left for guilt, only clarity. One evening, as I packed away Robert's old toolbox, I remembered something he'd said once when we were building the back porch together. Measure twice cut once. Mistakes can't always be fixed. Back then, he'd meant wood and nails. Now I understood he'd meant life. 6 weeks. That was the plan. Quiet, deliberate, clean. I would sell the house, settle the debts, and step away without a single argument. When the door finally closed behind me, they would still be sleeping, unaware that everything had changed. I looked around the house one last time before heading to bed. The photos on the walls, the faint smell of lavender from the garden, the hum of the refrigerator, all the small sounds of a home that no longer felt like mine. I smiled to myself, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. By the time they noticed, the house would no longer be theirs to live in. That thought carried me through the next few weeks like a small, secret flame in my chest, quiet, steady, hidden. Life in the house went on as usual, at least from the outside. Jenna was preoccupied with her mother's upcoming move, sorting out furniture and paint samples. Daniel spent most evenings buried in work emails, barely looking up from his laptop. No one paid much attention to me, which was precisely what I needed. I had become part of the wallpaper, invisible and harmless. That made it easy to plan the next step. One morning I decided to have a little fun, or maybe I just needed to remind myself I still had a sense of humor. I went to the garage, dug through the old storage boxes, and pulled out things that hadn't seen daylight in decades. A mismatched set of teacups, a radio that only played static 3 ceramic roosters that used to sit on the kitchen windowsill. I carried them to the front yard and set up a folding table. Then I made a sign in big red letters, "Yard sale. Everything must go." By the time the neighbors started strolling by, I was sitting in a lawn chair with a pitcher of lemonade beside me. Mrs. Turner called out Edna from across the street. "You're having a yard sale. You finally decluttering." I smiled. "You could say that," I answered. "Just practicing letting go." She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, I hope you're not selling that old birdhouse your husband made. My Stan still talks about it." I chuckled. "Oh, that stays. Some things aren't for sale." Soon, a few more neighbors wandered over. People love yard sales. They can't resist rummaging through someone else's history. I watched them pick up objects, turn them over, and ask questions that had nothing to do with price. It was oddly freeing. Every item that left the table felt like a tiny piece of weight lifting off me. Around noon, Jenna came home and stood at the window frowning slightly before stepping outside. "Mom, what on earth are you doing?" she asked, folding her arms. "Oh, just clearing out old things," I said cheerfully. "I figured it's time to make a little space." She gave me that tight smile she uses when she's trying to be polite, but also annoyed. "You could have told me. I almost drove past without realizing this was our yard." "Well," I said, pouring her a glass of lemonade, "you're always saying we need to modernize. I'm just doing my part." She didn't laugh. "Do you really need to sell half the kitchenware, though?" she asked, glancing at the table. "That old blender." "We never use it," I said. "Besides, someone offered me $20 for it." Her eyebrows shot up. "You sold the blender." "That's mine." I smiled sweetly. "Then I suppose we'll split the profit. 10 for each of us." For a second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Frustration mixed with disbelief. But she said nothing. She walked back into the house muttering, "You're unbelievable," which I took as a compliment. Daniel came home later that evening looking exhausted. When he saw the almost empty table and the sign still fluttering in the breeze, he raised an eyebrow. "A yard sale?" he asked carefully. "What brought that on?" "Oh, just clearing out clutter," I said, keeping my tone light. "You know, practicing letting go." He studied me for a moment, his gaze searching. I could tell he sensed something beneath the surface, something I wasn't saying. But true to form, he chose silence over confrontation. He only nodded and said, "Well, it looks like you made some good money." "Yes," I said. "People love other people's junk. There's a lesson in that somewhere." He smiled faintly, but I could see the unease behind it. Maybe he felt the shift, that subtle rebalancing of control. The next afternoon, Linda came by under the pretense of discussing home insurance updates. I made sure Jenna was out running errands. Linda parked down the street and walked up the driveway, her tote bag full of paperwork. "Afternoon, Mrs. Turner," she said brightly. "I just need your signature on some coverage documents." We went inside, closing the door behind us. "Everything's moving along," she whispered once we were alone. "The buyers love the house. Inspections scheduled for next week." I felt a ripple of relief mixed with guilt. "Thank you, Linda," I said. "I don't know how I'd manage this without you." "You taught me to think before acting," she replied. "I guess I'm just returning the favor." We both smiled, and for a moment I could almost forget the gravity of what I was doing. Before she left, she glanced at the window and noticed the yard sale sign still standing in the grass. "You really are committed to the act," she said quietly. "Doesn't anyone suspect?" I shook my head. "Jenna thinks I've finally gone a little eccentric. Daniel doesn't want to ask questions. Everyone sees what they want to see." Linda smiled. "You always were the smartest person in the room, Mrs. Turner." As she walked down the driveway, the late afternoon sun caught the red letters of my sign, still bold and slightly crooked from the breeze. She turned once to wave, then looked again at the words as if they meant something more than a joke. As Linda left, the sign still read, "Everything must go," but this time, she wasn't sure it was a joke. The next few days moved in a slow, careful rhythm, each one carrying me closer to the moment I'd been planning for weeks. The house felt quieter now, almost as if it knew what was coming. The laughter from the living room no longer reached my ears the same way. Jenna spent her evenings browsing furniture catalogs for her mother's arrival, and Daniel, though polite, avoided lingering conversations. It was as if everyone had quietly agreed that I was already halfway gone. I used that silence to prepare. Late one afternoon, Linda came by with a thick folder under her arm. She placed it gently on the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd once helped Daniel with his homework, where Robert and I used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings. "Everything's ready," she said softly. "All that's left is your signature. Once you sign, the closing process begins." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at the folder as if it might open itself and reveal a different ending, one where my family had chosen love over convenience. But that story had already been written, and I knew how it ended. I took a deep breath and gestured for her to sit. "Let's look through it together," I said. We spent an hour going over each page carefully. The numbers lined up, the buyer's offer was fair, the debt was cleared, everything was clean and final. When we finished, Linda leaned back, watching me closely. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. "Once you sign, there's no going back." I looked around the kitchen, the newly painted cabinets Jenna had chosen, the digital clock. Daniel installed the framed pictures I had moved from room to room for 40 years. Everything was familiar, yet nothing felt like it belonged to me anymore. "I used to think this house was a part of who I was," I said. "But lately it feels like I'm just holding on to someone else's life." Linda nodded, but said nothing. She didn't have to. I reached for the folder and flipped to the final page, the one marked in yellow where I was meant to sign. My hand hovered over the paper pen poised, and for a moment I hesitated. I thought of Robert. I could almost hear him again, that easy confidence in his voice, when he'd first shown me the blueprints for this place. "We'll build it strong enough to outlast us," he'd said, "so it'll always feel like home." And it had for a time. But the truth I had come to understand was that walls don't hold love. People do. And when people change, the house becomes a shell, no matter how solid the foundation. Keeping it now wouldn't bring Robert back. It wouldn't make Daniel the boy he once was. It would only keep me trapped in memories that had started to hurt more than heal. I pressed the pen to the paper. My eyes stung, but my hand was steady. "You know," I said quietly, "I thought I'd cry when this moment came." Linda smiled gently. "Maybe that means you've already done your grieving." The pen glided smoothly as I wrote my name, and when I lifted it, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't relief exactly, but something steadier, a sense of rightness. I had protected what Robert and I built. I had done it without shouting, without bitterness. I'd chosen dignity. Linda gathered the papers and slid them into her folder. "It'll take a few weeks to finalize," she said. "I'll keep everything discreet until closing day. The buyers are good people by the way they fell in love with your garden." I smiled faintly. Robert would have liked that. After she left, I stayed at the table for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. The house seemed to breathe around me, soft and familiar. I traced the wood grain under my fingers, feeling both the weight of goodbye and the freedom that waited just beyond it. That evening, Daniel and Jenna came home later than usual. I'd made dinner chicken stew, the kind Robert loved, and set 3 plates at the table. Jenna smiled as she passed through the kitchen, distracted and cheerful. "Smells great, Mom," she said. I smiled back, hiding the faint tremor in my chest. They didn't notice that the pile of envelopes on the counter was gone, that the papers that once bound this house to their names had already been signed away. After they went to bed, I stepped out to the porch. The garden was quiet, except for the soft hum of crickets. I thought again of Robert's words, "Never beg for your place. Protect it or walk away with dignity." For years, I'd thought dignity meant endurance staying put, proving I could weather anything. But now, I understood it differently. Dignity was knowing when to leave with grace before bitterness took root. The moonlight caught the edge of the yard sale sign still leaning against the fence. I smiled at the sight of it, the joke that had almost been true. Maybe in a way it still was. I went inside, turned off the lights, and stood for a long moment at the foot of the stairs, listening to the house one last time, the soft creak of the wood, the sigh of the air through the vents. It had been a good home. But homes, like people, have their time. When I finally went to bed, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, my mind clear for the first time in months. Closing was set for the day before Carol's big move-in. That date had been circled in my mind for weeks, and when it finally arrived, I woke before dawn. The house was still and blue in the early light, the kind of stillness that belongs to endings. I moved through each room quietly, touching surfaces, closing drawers, making sure everything was in its place. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon polish. On the counter sat the sealed envelope I had written the night before, addressed simply to Daniel and Jenna. It wasn't a letter of anger. It was an explanation, a goodbye, and perhaps a lesson. Outside, the air was cool enough that I could see my breath. The maple tree Robert and I planted decades ago had begun to turn red at the edges. I stood on the porch and looked out at it for a long moment, remembering how he'd joked that one day we'd grow old together under its shade. I smiled softly. I supposed in some way we had. By 7 o'clock, I had packed the last box into the trunk of my car. Linda arrived a few minutes later, her headlights cutting through the mist. She stepped out with her usual calm confidence, holding a thermos of coffee and 2 paper cups. "Morning," she said gently. "Ready?" I nodded. "As I'll ever be." We sat in her car for a moment, sipping coffee in silence. "You don't have to stay for the handoff," she offered. "The buyers are good people. I'll handle everything." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'd rather be gone before they arrive. It's better that way." At 8:15, I walked through the front door one last time. The house was empty now, echoing faintly with the hollow sounds of footsteps and memory. I turned the key in the lock, feeling the faint click as it turned. My reflection caught in the hallway mirror, older, yes, but not broken. "Goodbye, Robert," I whispered. Then I slipped the key into a small envelope labeled New Owners, placed it beside the note for Daniel and Jenna, and set both on the kitchen counter. As I stepped outside, Linda closed her car trunk and gave me a reassuring nod. "You've done the hardest part," she said. "Everything after this is just paperwork." I smiled at her. "Paperwork," I repeated softly. "That's one way to put it." We got into her car and started down the driveway just as a moving truck turned onto the street. I watched through the side mirror as the truck slowed in front of the house. 2 men climbed out laughing, one of them pointing toward the porch. My porch. Then we turned the corner, and I couldn't see them anymore. The drive to my new apartment took about an hour. Linda chatted about the coastal town where I'd be living, about a local cafe that made fresh scones every morning. I listened, grateful for the distraction. When we reached the apartment, she helped me carry a few boxes inside. It was small but bright, with a view of the ocean in the distance. The sound of the waves came faintly through the open window. "It suits you," she said. "It feels peaceful." After she left, I unpacked slowly, hanging Robert's photograph by the window and setting my teacup on the counter. I felt a quiet peace settle over me. For the first time in months, no one expected anything of me. No one needed me to move out of the way, make space, or disappear. I made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and let the light pour over me. Meanwhile, I imagined what must be happening back at the house. I could see it in my mind as clearly as if I were standing there. Jenna's car pulling into the driveway, Daniel carrying boxes, marked Carol's room. Laughter and chatter filling the air. The front door swinging open, and then confusion. Jenna stepping inside first, blinking at the sight of furniture that wasn't hers. A strange couch, different curtains. Strangers moving boxes, marked living room and office. Daniel following behind her, his smile faltering. Carol, cheerful and unsuspecting, asking, "Where should I put the vase?" Then one of the new homeowners, a friendly woman in a denim jacket, turning toward them with an apologetic smile. "Oh, you must be the previous owners," she'd say kindly, holding out a hand. "We were hoping to meet you. It's such a beautiful home. The agent said you left it in perfect condition." I imagined Jenna's face draining of color, her voice caught in her throat. Daniel standing still silent, his hand tightening around the box he held. Carol looking from one to the other in confusion. Previous owners, she'd ask. What does she mean they would realize then? They would see the truth laid bare, not through anger or shouting, but through the calm inevitability of consequence. The house they thought would be theirs had already moved on, just as I had. Linda had promised to deliver the closing papers in person that afternoon, along with a small note to confirm the transfer. But I had one more message to send, something more personal. So before leaving the bank earlier that morning, I arranged for a courier delivery to their address, timed perfectly for that moment. Back at my new apartment, I took another sip of tea and looked toward the horizon. The tide was coming in the waves, glinting in the sun. Somewhere miles away, a knock would sound at my old front door. Jenna, still stunned, would answer it. Then a courier handed Jenna an envelope from Mrs. Turner. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine the moment with startling clarity. I was sitting by the window of my new apartment, the ocean spread wide and calm before me, when the thought came unbidden. By now, they'd have carried the boxes inside, laughing, still unaware of what was waiting for them. I pictured the sound of tape being ripped open, of paper crumpling, of Jenna giving quick instructions in that clipped, efficient tone she used when she wanted to be in control. And then the knock at the door. The envelope had been sealed in thick ivory paper, my handwriting, neat and unmistakable. It wasn't dramatic, not meant to humiliate. It was just the truth, wrapped in courtesy. The courier would hand it over, nod politely, and leave them standing there unsure of what to do next. I imagined Daniel staring at it first, uncertain, while Jenna crossed her arms, already impatient. She'd probably mutter something like, "What now?" before tearing it open. Inside, the first page would be a copy of the sale documents, official, notarized beyond dispute. Then the receipts, one from the bank confirming the mortgage was paid in full, the other showing the transfer of ownership. My name clean and final, next to the buyer's. And finally, a short note written in my steady teacher's script. "You said there's no space for me. Now there's plenty." I could almost see Jenna's fingers tightening around the paper as she read those words, her face blanching, her lips parting slightly, but no sound coming out. That polite confidence of hers, the one she wore like a shield, would crumble in a single heartbeat. The house around her, the one she had redecorated, claimed and planned to fill with her own mother would no longer belong to her. She would look up then, perhaps expecting Daniel to deny it, to say it wasn't true. But Daniel wouldn't. He would just stand there, frozen. I knew him well enough to know the look that would come over his face, the same one he wore as a boy, when he'd broken something he couldn't fix. The guilt would sit heavy on him as it always did. But this time, there would be no quick repair, no quiet apology that made everything right again. The silence between them would stretch thick and painful. I could picture Carol, too, standing awkwardly in the entryway, clutching her handbag, watching the scene unfold without understanding it. "What's going on?" she'd ask, her voice uncertain. Jenna wouldn't answer right away. She'd keep staring at the papers, the edges trembling slightly in her hands. Then she'd look up at Daniel, her voice small now, stripped of all the control she loved so much. "Did you know about this?" she'd whisper. And Daniel, my son, would drop his gaze to the floor. That was the image that hurt me most. I loved him still, even now. But love doesn't mean excusing betrayal. It means letting someone face the weight of their choices. I turned my eyes back to the sea. A flock of gulls dipped low over the water, their white wings flashing in the sunlight. I took a slow breath and told myself this was not revenge. This was consequence. I had simply handed back what they had tried to take from me and done it with civility. I had not shouted, not cursed, not slammed a single door. I had just walked away. Still, I could feel the echo of that moment, as if it were happening right in front of me, Jenna's trembling hands, Daniel's silence, Carol's confusion. The new owners standing nearby, uncomfortable, trying to make sense of it all. The wife kind but firm, saying, "I'm sorry, we were told the sale was final. We just moved in this morning." Maybe Jenna would try to speak, then her voice breaking. There must be some mistake, she'd say, grasping for control. But there wouldn't be. The documents in her hands would say it all, the ink still fresh, the signatures clear. I imagined Daniel sinking onto the step, the paper crinkling in his fist. Guilt would hit him harder than any words could. He would think of me packing, quietly smiling, as if everything was fine, never letting on what I knew. He would realize too late that I'd given him every chance to do right, and that I had chosen peace instead of confrontation. That's what would haunt him most. The afternoon sun shifted on the water outside my window. I traced the rim of my teacup, wondering what he was doing at that exact moment. Maybe holding the papers in his lap, maybe whispering my name under his breath. I didn't need to see it. I'd lived long enough to understand that some reckonings don't need witnesses. They happen quietly inside the people who caused them. For a long time, I sat in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the ocean. I felt no triumph, no glee, just a deep, steady calm. The kind of peace that comes when a wrong has been righted, not through anger, but through patience. And then, as I imagined them standing there in the doorway, stunned, speechless, holding the evidence of what they'd lost, I could see one more moment unfold. Jenna's eyes scanning the counter, searching for some explanation, some hope of reversal. And Daniel turning back toward the kitchen, noticing something else lying there half hidden beneath the papers. A second envelope, smaller with handwriting that only he would recognize. But Daniel found a second envelope marked, "For my son." I could see it in my mind as if I were standing right there in the room. The quiet pause, the trembling of his fingers as he picked it up, the way Jenna must have watched him with a mix of dread and curiosity. I had written his name carefully on that envelope, not as a punishment, not as a final word of anger, but as a message only a mother could give. The ink had bled slightly where my hand had trembled, but every word inside was deliberate. It was the letter I'd written after many sleepless nights, when forgiveness finally began to feel possible. As I sat by the window in my new apartment, I pictured him sliding his thumb under the seal, opening it slowly. The paper would unfold easily. It wasn't long, just a single page. My handwriting, the same he'd grown up seeing on grocery lists and birthday cards, would look almost too familiar for the words it carried. My dear son, it began. You borrowed against what your father built. I forgive you. I had stopped there for a long time when writing that sentence. The truth of it had stung even as I wrote it down. Robert had worked so hard for that house, every beam and nail a piece of his devotion to us, and Daniel, without thinking, had risked it all. But what use was anger now? He was my son, the only one I had. So I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to bitterness would only poison what little peace I had left. I imagined his eyes moving down the page, lingering on the next lines. A home isn't made of walls or wood. It's made of the love and respect we show each other inside it. When those things are gone, the walls mean nothing. I had learned that lesson the hard way. It was the truth that set me free the moment I'd walked out of that house for the last time. There was one more sentence, one I'd added at the very end, as my final act of motherhood. I've enclosed something small to help you start again. Build wisely this time. Inside the envelope beneath the letter was a check, a modest amount, but enough to give him a chance to find his footing. It wasn't meant as a gift or payment. It was a reminder that even when trust is broken, love doesn't vanish completely. It simply changes shape. I could see it all unfolding in my mind. Daniel would read the letter once, twice, maybe 3 times, his lips moving silently over the words. He would reach the part about forgiveness and stop there as if he couldn't quite believe it. Then he'd glance at the check, blinking, his face pale and drawn. Jenna, still standing beside him, would look over his shoulder, reading quietly, realizing that this wasn't revenge, it was something much heavier. She'd see in those words a kind of grace she herself didn't yet understand. The woman who'd thought she'd won had been offered no punishment, only reflection. That realization would shake her more than any anger could. Daniel's shoulders would begin to shake. Not dramatically, but in that small, contained way men do when they've been holding everything inside for too long. The papers in his hands would blur as his vision filled with tears. The guilt that had been building since the day he signed my name without my permission would finally break him open. I knew him well enough to know that words like "I forgive you" would hit harder than any rebuke. He'd remember the afternoons I spent teaching him about responsibility, about telling the truth. He'd remember the time he broke his father's watch and tried to hide it, and how I'd told him then, "It's not the breaking that matters, Daniel. It's what you do after." And maybe, just maybe, he'd hear that echo now. Jenna, for all her pride, would be quiet. I imagined her standing there beside him, realizing what she'd lost, not just the house, but the faith of the woman she'd underestimated. Her ambition had been clever, but not wise. She'd think of every sharp word she'd spoken, every decision she'd made, as if I were in the way, and she'd understand the depth of what she'd done. I didn't want her to suffer. I only wanted her to see. The ocean breeze brushed through the curtains, and I looked down at the pen still sitting on my desk, the same one I'd used to sign the sale papers, and the same one I'd used to write that letter. It struck me then how the same tool could serve both endings and beginnings. I hoped Daniel would see that too. Forgiveness doesn't erase what's been done, but it allows something softer to take root in its place. Maybe in time he would come to visit. Maybe he'd bring Ella and we'd sit by the sea talking about the things that really matter, or maybe not. Either way, I had done what I could. The rest was his to carry. I imagined him lowering his head, the paper trembling in his hands. I imagined Jenna reaching for him, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder, her eyes filling as the weight of it all settled in the choices, the losses, the quiet mercy offered by someone she'd cast aside. And in that moment, I knew the letter had done what it was meant to do. It had ended one story and begun another, not with fury, but with truth. For the first time, Jenna saw her husband cry for his mother. I didn't see that moment, but I felt it somehow like a shift in the air, a weight I'd been carrying for months, finally lifting. It wasn't joy exactly, or even satisfaction. It was something gentler, quieter, a sense that the truth had finally landed where it needed to. I imagined Daniel sitting there, the letter still in his hands, the room heavy with silence. Somewhere deep inside, I hoped that moment would be the beginning of something better for him, even if it came wrapped in sorrow. Weeks passed. The days at my seaside apartment grew into a rhythm I didn't expect to enjoy so quickly. Mornings began with the sound of gulls and the smell of salt in the air. I'd take my tea out to the balcony and watch the waves roll in, letting their steady rhythm calm the ache in my chest. Sometimes I wondered how they were managing, but I didn't let myself dwell on it. The past had a way of pulling you under if you stared at it too long. Still, the occasional piece of news drifted my way. Linda, ever discreet, mentioned that Daniel and Jenna had moved into a small rental house across town, a temporary solution she called it. It was a modest place, cramped and drafty, the kind of house where you could hear every sound through the walls. Ironically, after all that talk about space, they'd found themselves somewhere that had almost none. I tried not to smile at the irony, but it lingered with me all the same. I could picture it clearly. Boxes still unpacked, a mismatched couch in the living room, the two of them navigating around each other in a space too small to hold both their pride and their regrets. Daniel would come home tired, his voice softer than before, while Jenna would try to fill the silence with excuses, explanations, plans that no longer sounded certain. And then inevitably the arguments would begin quiet at first, then rising like a storm neither of them could control. "You never told me how bad it was," she'd say. "I was trying to fix it before you found out," he'd answer. "Well, you fixed it, didn't you?" She'd snap and he'd go silent again. I didn't need to hear the words to know how they'd sound. Guilt has a way of echoing even from miles away. What hurt most was thinking of Ella. She was only 8, still soft around the edges of the world, still believing that things could always be fixed with a hug or a promise. I imagined her small face, looking up at the new house confused, wondering why her parents spoke in tight voices and why Grandma wasn't around anymore. That thought stayed with me for days. Then, one afternoon, as I was sitting on the balcony, with a book I wasn't really reading, the mail carrier called up from below. "Mrs. Turner, got something special for you today." I went down to meet him, expecting another bank notice or a grocery coupon, but what he handed me was a large, crumpled envelope covered in bright stickers and careful, crooked handwriting. Across the front, in bold purple marker, were the words, "To Grandma by the Sea." I recognized Ella's handwriting immediately. My breath caught. The envelope was soft around the edges, as if it had traveled a long way or been handled too many times. I turned it over in my hands, smiling, despite the lump forming in my throat. Inside was a letter written in a child's uneven script. "Dear Grandma," it began. "Mom and Dad are fighting again. I told them I don't like this house. It's too small and it's always cold. I miss your pancakes and your stories and the sound of your garden. Daddy says you live by the sea now. Is it beautiful there? I think it is. I hope you're not lonely." I had to stop reading for a moment. The tears came before I could stop them. She had drawn tiny hearts along the edge of the paper, little waves near the bottom, and a big sun smiling over everything. At the end, she had written, "I'm going to write to you every week until you write back. Love, Ella." I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. The ache that came with it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't sharp or heavy. It was soft, alive, full of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe the bridge between us wasn't gone. Maybe it was just waiting for someone brave enough to start rebuilding. Over the next few days, I found myself rereading the letter again and again. I thought about what I might write back, how to explain things without bitterness, how to tell her that sometimes love means letting go of a place so others can find their way back to you. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was smaller, lighter, and covered in even more stickers: stars, seashells, a crooked rainbow. The handwriting was still crooked, but there was something more careful about it this time, as if she knew it mattered. I carried it inside, set it gently on the table, and took a deep breath before opening it. Inside the envelope was a child's drawing of a house with everyone inside again. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time just looking at it, tracing the uneven lines with my finger. The crayon colors were bright sunshine, yellow, sky blue, and a crooked red roof that looked suspiciously like the one Robert and I had built together all those years ago. There were 4 figures drawn inside the house, 2 tall, 2 small. One of them, with silver hair and a big smile, was clearly meant to be me. For the first time since leaving, I let myself cry, not out of sadness, but because I finally understood that even when a home is gone, love can still find its way back. The days that followed felt softer somehow. I began tending to the small balcony garden outside my apartment, planting herbs and wildflowers that thrived in the salty air. Each morning, I'd water them while the waves whispered below, and in the evenings I'd sit there with my notebook writing down stories, pieces of my life that I wanted Ella, and maybe even Daniel, to know one day. I didn't call it a memoir at first, but that's what it was, becoming a collection of memories, written not to dwell on pain, but to make peace with it. It was during one of those quiet mornings that I met Helen. She lived 2 doors down, a tall woman with soft gray curls, and a habit of carrying her cat everywhere she went. She introduced herself by knocking on my door with a jar of homemade jam in her hands. "New neighbor tax," she said with a laugh. I invited her in for tea, and before I knew it, we'd spent 2 hours talking. She'd lost her husband 10 years ago around the same time as me, and her children lived far away. There was an easy understanding between us, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. We started meeting every few days, sometimes on her porch, sometimes on mine. We talked about books, the stubbornness of grown children, and the strange ache of starting over. Helen had a way of making loneliness feel lighter, as if sharing it halved its weight. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, she said, "You know, Margaret, people like us, we're not just surviving. We're practicing a quieter kind of courage." I smiled at that. "Maybe that's what peace really is," I said. "Courage that doesn't need to prove itself." Life began to feel settled again. I cooked small dinners, learned the names of the fishermen who passed each morning, and started volunteering twice a week at the local library. It felt good to be useful again, to hear the laughter of children flipping through picture books, and to see in their eyes the same curiosity I used to see in my classroom. It reminded me that some parts of me hadn't been lost after all they'd just been waiting to be found again. Then one breezy afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a young man standing there holding a bouquet of daisies. He looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place him right away. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, smiling nervously. "I hope I'm not intruding. My name's Patrick Langley. You were my 4th grade teacher 25 years ago." I blinked in surprise. "Patrick Langley," I repeated. and suddenly I could see him as he'd been a freckle-faced boy who always stayed behind after class to ask questions about dinosaurs. "You grew up," I said with a laugh, and he grinned. "Eventually. I bought your old house." For a moment I couldn't speak. "You did?" I asked softly. I had no idea. He nodded. "When I saw the listing, I recognized the address. I used to walk past it as a kid and think it was the most welcoming house in town. You told me once that a home is where kindness lives. I guess that stuck with me. When I saw it was yours, I thought, maybe it was time to give something back." His words caught me off guard. I felt warmth spread through me, not from pride, but from a deep, unexpected gratitude. Life had come full circle in the quietest, kindest way. "That's very generous of you," I said. "How are you finding it?" He smiled. "It feels right," he said simply, "like it's meant to be taken care of." He handed me the daisies. "I just wanted to thank you for the house and for everything you taught me. You probably don't remember, but you once told me that kindness isn't a lesson. It's a choice." After he left, I placed the flowers in a vase on the windowsill and sat for a long while, watching the sea through the glass. Kindness circles back, I thought. Always. Maybe not when we expect it, but it finds its way home just like the tide that never stops returning to shore. That night, I added a new page to my notebook. I wrote about Patrick, about Helen, about Ella's letters, and the unexpected peace that had settled into my days. I ended it with a simple line. Sometimes the reward for letting go is being found again. The next morning, the mail came as usual, a few bills, a flyer for a local concert, and one envelope that stopped me cold. The handwriting was unmistakable, careful, and familiar, the kind I'd known since the first time I taught him to hold a pencil. My heart gave a slow, steady beat as I turned it over. Then came another letter, this one from Daniel. I recognized the handwriting instantly, that same careful, slightly slanted script I'd seen on Mother's Day cards and forgotten grocery lists when he was a boy. My heart gave a small, startled jump as I held it. For a long time, I didn't open it. I just sat there at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the envelope, wondering what waited inside. Letters had a way of carrying weight far greater than their paper, and this one felt heavy before I even broke the seal. When I finally did, the first line stopped me cold. "Mom, I don't deserve for you to read this, but I hope you will." His words were steady but raw, each one chosen with the precision of someone afraid of saying too much or too little. He wrote about the months since everything had fallen apart, the sleepless nights, the guilt that came in waves, the silence that filled their little rental house like another person living among them. He admitted to the things I already knew, but seeing them in his own words made my eyes sting. "You were right," he wrote. "I borrowed against what Dad built. I thought I could fix things before you noticed. I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was destroy the trust you placed in me. I'm so sorry, Mom." I've said those words out loud 100 times, but they mean more here where you can see them. I read the letter slowly, pausing often. The words blurred now and then, and I had to blink them back into focus. He spoke of Jenna too, how she'd been quiet lately, more reflective. "She's in therapy now," he wrote. "She's trying to understand why she needed control so badly, why she couldn't just be grateful for what she had. She knows how deeply she hurt you. She's not asking for forgiveness yet, just the chance to earn it someday." I set the letter down for a moment, pressing my fingertips to my lips. The mention of Jenna stirred something I hadn't expected, a flicker of pity. I didn't know if I could ever trust her, but there was something strangely humbling about imagining her sitting in a therapist's office, unraveling her pride piece by piece. Maybe pain really could be a teacher, the same way I'd tried to be one all those years. The next paragraph was shorter, but it was the one that reached me most deeply. Ella talks about you every day, Daniel wrote. She keeps a little notebook she calls Letters to Grandma by the Sea. She tells us about the shells she wants to collect with you, about how she thinks the ocean must smell like your garden. She asks when she can see you again. I told her the truth that I didn't know. My throat tightened. I could almost hear her voice high and hopeful, the way she used to say, "Grandma, tell me a story," just before bedtime. I hadn't realized how much I missed that sound until then. The final lines of the letter were hesitant, as if he'd rewritten them a dozen times before letting them stay. Mom, I don't want to ask too much, but if you're willing, Ella and I would like to visit you, just for a day. No expectations, no pressure, only if you're ready. I understand if you're not. I just want you to know we're trying. I'm trying. I sat back in my chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. My first instinct was to protect myself, to say no, to preserve the peace I'd worked so hard to build. I'd found stability again. My days were quiet, my nights restful. Letting them back in could reopen wounds I had only just begun to heal. But the thought of Ella, of her little notebook, and her drawings of houses filled with love began to soften something in me. Helen came by that afternoon carrying a basket of scones, still warm from the oven. She found me at the table, the letter folded neatly beside my teacup. "You look like someone standing at a crossroads," she said, setting down the basket. I nodded. "Daniel wrote to me," I said quietly. "He wants to visit. With Ella." She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from me. "And what does your heart say?" "That I want to see her," I admitted. "But I don't know if I can face him. I don't know if I can open that door again." Helen reached across the table, her hand light on mine. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting," she said softly. "It's freedom. For them and for you. You can choose what that looks like. You don't have to let the past back in, but you can let love in. It's not the same thing." Her words settled over me like the afternoon sunlight, gentle but insistent. I thought of Robert, of the lessons we'd both tried to teach Daniel about decency and second chances. Maybe this was mine to give, not because he'd earned it, but because I was ready to be free of the hurt. That night I read Daniel's letter one more time. I traced the ink of his signature firm but unsteady, and felt the years between us collapse a little. I folded the letter and whispered, "All right. One visit." Those 3 words echoed in my mind for the next several days as I prepared my home in ways that had nothing to do with cleaning. I didn't change much, just freshened the flowers, opened the curtains wide, and baked the lemon loaf Ella had always loved. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about creating space again, not the kind that could be measured in square feet, but the kind that lives between people when they're brave enough to meet in honesty. The morning of their visit arrived clear and bright. I woke early, nerves fluttering like small wings in my chest. The sound of the waves outside felt steadier than my own heartbeat. By the time I heard the knock at the door, I had convinced myself to stay calm, to be kind but guarded. I opened the door, and all my rehearsed composure vanished in an instant. Grandma Ella's voice was pure sunlight. She dropped the stuffed bunny she'd been holding and ran straight into my arms. I caught her the air leaving my lungs as she hugged me tightly, her little face pressed against my shoulder. For a moment, the world fell away. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her hair. "You've grown taller." She laughed and pulled back her eyes bright. "Daddy says I eat like a horse." Daniel stood behind her, smiling shyly, his hands buried in his pockets. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. It was the same voice he used as a boy when he wasn't sure how I'd react to something. I took a slow breath and nodded. "Hello, Daniel?" We stood there for a beat too long, a lifetime of words unsaid between us. Finally, I stepped aside. "Come in." I made lemon loaf. The first hour passed gently. Ella explored my apartment, asking about the seashells on the windowsill and the photos on the walls. Daniel and I talked about small things, the weather, her school, the fishing boats we could see from the balcony. I could tell he wanted to say more, but he didn't push. It was enough that he was there sitting across from me with quiet respect instead of guilt. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that the second knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, Jenna stood there holding a wrapped frame against her chest. She looked different, thinner maybe, and softer somehow. Her hair was pulled back simply, and her eyes, though still sharp, carried something I hadn't seen before: humility. "I hope it's all right," she said, her voice cautious. "Daniel told me you said one visit. I didn't want to intrude." I hesitated just long enough for her to notice, then opened the door wider. "You're here now," I said. "Come in." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that feels like a question waiting for an answer. Inside, Ella beamed. Grandma showed me her flowers and the ocean. "Can we live here?" Jenna laughed quietly, setting the frame down on the table. "It's beautiful here," she said. "I can see why you like it." Then, as if bracing herself, she unwrapped the frame. It was an old photograph, the one that had hung in the hallway of my old home for decades. Robert, Daniel, and I standing in front of the house the day it was finished. The picture was familiar, but the frame wasn't. The old one had been worn and cracked. This one gleamed softly newly polished wood with small carvings of vines along the edge. Jenna held it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. "I found this when we were unpacking," she said. "It was in the box marked miscellaneous, which seems about right for me." She let out a shaky laugh. "I had it restored. I can't change what I did, but maybe I can frame it better." Something in my chest loosened at her words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition, a small piece of honesty offered like an olive branch. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Margaret," she said, "for everything. For forgetting that you were part of the home I was trying to build." We didn't say anything else after that. We didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, full of understanding that words couldn't carry. I poured tea, and the three of us sat at the small table by the window, Daniel, Jenna, and I, with Ella curled up beside me, her head resting on my arm. We talked a little about her school project and the funny things her teacher said, but mostly we just listened to the waves, to each other's breathing, to the fragile peace we were finally learning to share. As the light outside turned golden, Daniel glanced at the clock and sighed. "We should go," he said. "It's a long drive." Ella pouted, but didn't argue. She hugged me one more time, whispering, "I'll write you again soon." I kissed her cheek and smiled. "I'll be waiting." They stood at the doorway, the three of them together, and for the first time, I didn't see a wound when I looked at them. I saw the beginning of something mended, fragile, but real. As Daniel reached for his coat, I walked to the small desk by the window and picked up a sealed envelope I had written the night before. My handwriting stretched neatly across the front. "For when the time is right." I handed it to Daniel, my fingers brushing his. "For later," I said softly. "When you're ready." He looked at me, puzzled but respectful, and nodded. "Thank you, Mom." Before they left, I handed Daniel a sealed envelope for when the time is right. He didn't ask what it was, and I didn't explain. I just watched him slip it into his jacket pocket, my heart both heavy and light. When the door closed behind them, I stood there for a long moment, listening to the echo of their voices fade down the hallway. The apartment felt still again, but not empty. Something had shifted that day. Something subtle, but real. I no longer felt like a woman who had lost a family. I felt like one who had finally begun to understand what family meant. A week passed before I heard from him. The phone rang early one evening while the sun was setting in streaks of gold over the water. I answered, and Daniel's voice came through the line, steady but reverent. "Mom," he said. "We opened the envelope." I smiled quietly to myself, and I asked, though I already knew what was inside. There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries both surprise and humility. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. Inside that envelope were documents I'd spent months preparing tucked safely away until I knew the time had come. The Turner Family Home Foundation, that was its name. The idea had come to me one quiet morning while I was tending my flowers, thinking about how many older people I'd met over the years who had stories like mine, people who'd given their lives to their families only to find themselves unwanted at the end. Some had nowhere to go, nowhere they truly belonged. That thought had stayed with me like a thorn until I decided to do something about it. The foundation's purpose was simple: to provide housing, companionship, and dignity to elderly people who had been left behind. I'd used a portion of the money from the sale of my old home to fund it, along with Robert's life insurance savings. The motto, written at the top of the page, read, "No one should be told there's no space for them." I wanted those words to outlive me, to stand as a quiet protest against everything I had endured and everything I had learned to forgive. Daniel said he and Jenna had read through every page together, both of them silent, as they pieced together the meaning of what I'd done. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you created this in our name." "In our family's name," I corrected gently. "Mistakes and all. Because the story of our family shouldn't end with pain, it should continue with purpose." He told me that Jenna had started crying halfway through reading, not from guilt this time, but from something deeper. "She said it's the most generous thing she's ever seen," he said. "She wants to help, Mom. We both do." That admission caught me by surprise. "You mean that?" I asked softly. "Yes," he said. "We'd like to co-manage it with you. You started something good and we want to make it grow." When I hung up the phone, I felt Robert's presence in the quiet. I looked at his photograph on the mantel and whispered, "You see, it worked out after all." That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes only when the past stops knocking and the future starts to open its door. A few weeks later, Daniel and Jenna came to visit again. Ella ran up the steps ahead of them carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked along the way. "Daddy says we're going to help people now," she said proudly. I laughed, bending down to hug her. "Is that so?" "Well, I suppose I could use a few good helpers." Inside, I had prepared tea and cookies. The three of us sat around the small kitchen table, the same table where we'd once shared so much silence, now filled with a calm, new kind of conversation. Daniel spread the foundation documents out on the table, pointing out ideas he'd written in the margins: potential partners, fundraising plans, volunteer networks. Jenna listened quietly, nodding now and then. Her face had changed, softened. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me, "about how family isn't about walls. I think I understand now. I spent so long trying to control what my life looked like that I forgot what it felt like to truly belong somewhere." She hesitated, glancing at Daniel before continuing. "I can't change what I did, Margaret. But maybe I can spend the rest of my life making sure no one else feels that way." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't before. Humility, yes, but also courage. The courage to face what she had broken and to build something better in its place. That's all anyone can do, I said. We can't change the past, but we can make sure it wasn't wasted. Daniel reached across the table, his hand brushing mine as he smiled. Mom, you turned everything we destroyed into something that can save people. How did you do that? I thought for a moment before answering. I didn't lose my home, I said softly. I just expanded it. The room grew quiet, then filled only by the sound of waves crashing in the distance and the ticking of the old clock above the stove. I realized that peace doesn't always come as a grand moment of forgiveness. It often arrives in the small, steady breaths of people trying to do better. Ella began humming softly to herself, drawing another one of her colorful pictures at the table. Daniel and Jenna leaned in closer, reading over the paperwork again, making notes, planning together. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I was home right there in that moment. Jenna reached across the table and held my hand. That small gesture stayed with me long after they left, long after the sound of their car faded down the winding coastal road. It was the quiet beginning of something new, a slow, careful rebuilding that would stretch across years. What started as guilt and distance between us grew into understanding and eventually into love that had been tested and proven true. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges if we let it. The years since that day have moved gently, like the tide outside my window. I'm older now. My hands tremble when I write, and my walks along the shore are shorter. But peace has settled into my life like a lifelong guest, finally returning home. The Turner Family Home Foundation has become something larger than I ever imagined. Daniel and Jenna run it together now, and it has grown far beyond our little town. Every month I receive letters from people across the state. Families who found hope, older women who were given homes, men who rediscovered dignity after being forgotten. Each story feels like a quiet miracle, one built from the same pain that once broke me. Daniel visits often. He's more patient now, slower to speak, quicker to listen. Sometimes he reads aloud from the foundation's updates, his voice full of pride. "You did this, Mom," he tells me, and I always smile. "No," I say, "we did this." Because it's true, what began as an act of reclaiming became something shared, something that belongs to all of us. I see the way he looks at Jenna now, the softness in his eyes, and I know he's learned what I always hoped he would, that love isn't about control, but care. Jenna has changed too. She's warmer, quieter. When she visits, she brings flowers from her garden, the kind I used to grow. Sometimes she helps me tend to my balcony pots, her hands moving gently through the soil. "I think of you every time I plant something new," she said once, smiling faintly. "You taught me that homes aren't built with walls, they're grown." It took me a long time to realize she wasn't talking about the plants. And then there's Ella. She's 16 now, tall and full of dreams that spill out faster than she can catch them. She still writes me letters even though she visits every weekend. The habit never left her, and I've saved everyone in a box by my bedside. She helps at the foundation now, too, organizing clothing drives, visiting the residents, listening to their stories with a tenderness that feels like it was passed down through the generations. "Grandma," she told me once, "the people there say you gave them a second chance. But I think you gave us one too." I didn't answer then. I just pulled her close and let her rest her head against my shoulder. The house that once divided us no longer exists, not the walls at least. But its spirit lives on in every home the foundation builds, in every person who finds belonging after being told they didn't fit anywhere. Sometimes I sit by the window and imagine Robert beside me, his hand resting on mine, the two of us watching the sunset like we used to. I think he'd be proud. I think he'd understand that what we built together was never meant to stay confined to one address. It was always meant to grow. Lately, my body has been reminding me that I'm nearing the end of my journey. There are days when the stairs seem steeper, when my breath comes shorter. But there is no fear left in me, only gratitude. I have lived through betrayal and healing through loss and renewal. And somehow every piece of it has brought me here, to this quiet, sunlit room by the sea, where love finally feels uncomplicated. Today, I wrote my last journal entry. The pages are nearly full now, filled with memories and lessons I hope my family will read one day. On this final page, I wrote, "When they said there was no space for me, they were right. I hadn't made my own space yet." I looked at those words for a long time before closing the book. It struck me how true they were, not in bitterness, but in wonder. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to a place that no longer fit me, when all along I was meant to build a different kind of home, one that could never be sold or lost. This evening, the sky is painted in soft pinks and golds. I'm sitting in my favorite chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the waves roll toward the shore. From here, the ocean seems endless, as if it could hold every story, every sorrow, every joy I've ever known. The gulls drift lazily overhead, and the light outside is beginning to fade. Daniel and Jenna will be here soon, with Ella bringing supper and laughter. I'll hear their voices before I see them, the same way I used to hear Robert's footsteps before he came through the door. As the horizon darkens, I feel an immense calm settle over me. Everything that once felt broken has found its place again, pieced together in ways I never could have planned. The waves rise and fall, whispering something soft and eternal against the shore. I close my eyes and let that sound carry me, my heart light, my soul unburdened. Some spaces, it turns out, are made of forgiveness.